The bathroom door had been locked from the outside. Inside, my husband was banging on it with his fist, shouting my name, while my best friend sobbed and begged him to calm down. Water was spilling over the edge of the bathtub, slowly seeping beneath the door and onto the tile floor. I stood in the hallway, gripping my phone, my hands trembling so badly that I had to steady myself against the wall. "Paula," Dan shouted. "Open this door right now." Instead of responding, I dialed another number. When the man on the other end picked up, I spoke just one sentence. "You need to come over now." That was the exact moment my life divided into two halves, everything before that Thursday afternoon, and everything that followed. My name is Paula Mercer. I was 48 years old when it happened. I had been married for 22 years to Dan Mercer, the owner of a small plumbing business in Evansville, Indiana. Until that day, I believe my life was simple and ordinary. We lived in a quiet subdivision on the west side of town. My husband worked long hours, and I had a job at a physical therapy clinic where I checked in patients and handled insurance paperwork. There was nothing particularly exciting about my life, but there was nothing broken either, or at least, that's what I thought. That Thursday had started out like any other. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my last patient canceled their appointment. A cold front was moving in from the Ohio River, and it seemed like half the town had decided to head home early. My coworker Diane glanced over at me and said, "You might as well leave, Paula. No one else is coming in today." I double-checked the schedule just to be certain. "All right," I replied. "I'll pick up something for dinner on my way home." As I drove out of the parking lot, I remember feeling unusually lighthearted. The sky had that pale gray autumn shade we often get in southern Indiana just before the weather turns cold. Leaves drifted across the road, and the faint scent of wood smoke lingered in the air from someone's chimney. I stopped at Meijer, as I usually did, and picked up a rotisserie chicken, potato salad, and coffee creamer, hazelnut, Dan's favorite, since we were nearly out. I even grabbed a small pumpkin pie, because he had mentioned earlier in the week that he was craving one. Looking back, that detail almost makes me laugh. There I was, buying dessert for the man who was in the process of destroying our marriage. When I pulled into the driveway around 3:30, the first thing I noticed was Dan's truck. It was parked at an odd angle, as if he had pulled in hastily. That didn't make sense. He was supposed to be across the river in Henderson, installing a water heater in a restaurant kitchen, a job that should have taken the entire afternoon. I sat in the car for a moment, thinking perhaps the job had been canceled. That does happen sometimes in construction. But the moment I stepped through the garage door, something felt off. The house was too quiet, not the comfortable silence of an empty home, but something heavier, more unsettling. Then I noticed the smell. Perfume. Strong, sweet, and definitely not mine. Standing in the kitchen with a bag of groceries in my hands, I took a slow breath, trying to recognize the scent. Then it clicked. Terry Barlow had worn that exact perfume for years. Cheap, overpowering, impossible to ignore. Terry wasn't just someone I knew casually. She had been my best friend for 11 years. We met at a church fundraiser when our kids were still in middle school, and over the years, we had shared lunches, gone to garage sales, and supported each other through surgeries and family struggles. She had sat in that very kitchen countless times, drinking coffee with me. That's why the next thing I saw felt so surreal. Draped over a chair near the hallway was her leopard print blouse. For a few seconds, my mind scrambled to come up with explanations. Maybe she had stopped by. Maybe Dan had come home early as well. Maybe. Then I noticed the wine glasses. 2 of them, sitting half empty on the counter. Dan never drank wine in the middle of the day. A tight knot formed in my stomach as I slowly walked down the hallway. On the floor, I saw Dan's belt, then a pair of jeans, and then a bra. Terry's. A trail of water stretched across the tile toward the master bathroom. From inside, I could hear laughter, low, relaxed, familiar. My chest felt like it was collapsing, yet somehow my legs kept moving. I reached the bathroom door and pushed it open. What I saw is something I will never fully forget. Dan and Terry were sitting together in the large soaking tub we had installed during our bathroom remodel 3 years earlier, the one I had personally chosen. Back then, It had felt like a reward after months of physical therapy for my back injury, a place where I could finally relax. Now was filled with bubbles, and two people staring at me as if I were the one intruding. For a moment, no one said anything. Dan blinked, looking as guilty as a child caught cheating on a test. "Paula," he said carefully, "this isn't what it." Terry quickly grabbed a towel, trying to cover herself. "Oh my God," she whispered. But I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I simply looked at them. Then I stepped back out of the room, closed the door, and walked to the linen closet. Inside, there's a small metal key we keep because the bathroom lock tends to stick. I picked it up, turned the lock from the outside, and paused. Almost immediately, Dan began pounding on the door. "Paula, what the hell are you doing?" Terry's voice broke into sobs. "Please, open the door." Their panic filled the room now, replacing the calm laughter from just moments earlier. I walked into the living room, turned on the television, and let the sound of a routine afternoon news broadcast, something about traffic delays on Interstate 69, fill the house. Behind me, the banging continued. I sat down on the couch, my hands shaking so badly that I had to set the grocery bag aside before I dropped it. And somehow, out of everything in that moment, I found myself staring at the pumpkin pie. That stupid pie suddenly felt like the saddest thing in the world. I picked up my phone, scrolled to a name, Glenn Barlow, Terry's husband. Glenn ran the Napa Auto Parts store over on Green River Road. He was one of the calmest men I'd ever met, quiet, hardworking, the kind of person who fixed things instead of complaining about them. The phone rang twice. Then Glenn answered. "Hello?" My voice sounded strangely steady when I spoke. "You better come over now." There was a pause. "Paula, what's going on?" I looked down the hallway toward the locked bathroom door. Water was starting to seep out under it. "Bring your eyes," I said. "That's all." Glenn didn't ask another question. "I'm on my way." When the call ended, I sat there listening to the sounds in my house. The television, the pounding on the door, the muffled arguing. My marriage falling apart in real time. 10 minutes later, a pickup truck pulled into the driveway. I walked to the front door and opened it. Glenn stepped out of the driver's seat. But he wasn't alone. A smaller figure climbed out of the passenger side. Even from the porch light, I recognized her immediately, Marlene Barlow, Terry's 72-year-old mother. Glenn walked up the steps and said quietly, "My mother-in-law heard part of the call when I was leaving her house." Marlene folded her arms and looked me straight in the eye. "If my daughter's doing what I think she's doing," she said, "I'm not missing it." Behind us, Dan slammed his shoulder into the bathroom door again. "Paula." I stepped aside and let them both inside. Something told me the real storm hadn't even started yet. Glenn closed the front door behind him, and the three of us stood there for a moment in the quiet living room. The television kept talking about traffic conditions on Interstate 69 like nothing unusual was happening. Down the hallway, my husband slammed his fist against the bathroom door again. "Paula, this isn't funny." Marlene tilted her head toward the noise. "That him?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "And my daughter?" "Yes." She nodded once, like someone confirming a suspicion she'd had for a long time. "Well," she said calmly, "let's go see what kind of mess she's made." We walked down the hallway together. Dan must have heard the footsteps because the pounding stopped. "Paula," he said, "who's out there?" I didn't answer. Glenn stepped forward and spoke through the door. "It's Glenn." The silence on the other side of that door was instant, heavy, uncomfortable. Then Terry's voice came through, shaky and small. "Glenn." He didn't raise his voice. Glenn wasn't the yelling type. "How long?" he asked. No one answered. I could hear the faint slosh of bathwater, the creak of someone shifting in the tub. Finally, Terry said, "It's not what you think." Marlene let out a soft snort. "Oh, honey," she muttered under her breath, "it's exactly what we think." Inside the bathroom, Dan cleared his throat. "Glenn, listen, things just got a little." "Stop," Glenn said quietly. His voice didn't rise, but it carried a weight I had never heard before. "How long?" Terry started crying. "A few months," she said. "Just a few months." That's what she said, but Dan stayed silent. And that silence told me more than any confession could have. I looked at Glenn. He was staring straight at the door, not angry, not shouting, just very still. Then he took his phone out of his pocket and turned on the camera. "Paula," he said, "unlock the door." My hand tightened around the little metal key. For a second, I thought about leaving them in there, letting them sit with their lies a little longer. But Glenn deserved to see the truth. So I stepped forward, turned the lock, and opened the door. The bathroom looked like something out of a bad sitcom. Steam hung in the air. Water had spilled across the tile. Dan and Terry were still sitting in the tub, both wrapped awkwardly in towels. The moment the door opened, Dan jumped into action. "Terry slipped," he said quickly. "She hit her head. I was helping her." Glenn slowly lifted his phone and pointed it at the room. 2 wine glasses sat on the vanity. A scented candle burned beside them. Clothes were scattered everywhere. Dan stopped talking. The lie collapsed under its own weight. Terry looked from Glenn to her mother and back again. "Mama," she whispered. Marlene stared at her for a long time. Then she said something I don't think anyone in that room will ever forget. "I didn't raise a thief, Terry." Terry blinked. "What?" Marlene stepped farther into the doorway. "You heard me." Her voice was calm, almost tired. "You didn't just steal another woman's husband. You tried to steal the life she built." Terry shook her head quickly. "That's not." "Oh, it absolutely is," Marlene said. Dan tried to regain control of the conversation. "Everyone needs to calm down," he said. "This is getting blown way out of proportion." Glenn finally looked at him. Not angry, not yelling, just deeply disappointed. "Is it?" he asked. Dan didn't answer. Marlene turned toward Glenn.
"Tell her," she said.
Glenn hesitated for a second. Then he spoke. "This morning, I checked our savings account," he said quietly. Terry stiffened in the tub. Glenn continued. $20,000 is gone." Terry opened her mouth, but Glenn wasn't finished. "I also talked to a realtor friend of mine." My stomach tightened. Dan shifted his weight in the tub. "Glenn," he said carefully, "this isn't the place for—" "You and my wife have been looking at property near Lake Barkley," Glenn said. The bathroom went completely still. Even the dripping faucet seemed to pause. Glenn looked at me then. I figured Paula deserved to know, too. I felt the words hit my chest like cold water. Lake Barkley, that wasn't a vacation plan. That was a new life. Dan tried to laugh it off. "Look, we talked about buying a place someday," he said. "That doesn't mean with money from Mercer Plumbing?" Glenn asked. Dan's face changed, just a little, but enough. I suddenly remembered something. 3 months earlier, I had approved an invoice for equipment Dan claimed he needed for a commercial project, $8,000. The equipment never arrived. At the time, I assumed there had been a delay with the supplier. Now, everything was starting to make sense. Marlene crossed her arms. "Let me understand this," she said. She pointed at Terry. "You take money from your husband." Then she pointed at Dan. "You take money from your business, and the two of you plan to run away together to some lake cabin." No one responded. Terry broke down crying again. "It wasn't like that," she said. Glenn looked directly at her. "Then what was it like?" Terry had no answer. Dan rubbed his forehead. "This whole situation is getting ridiculous," he muttered. But no one in the room believed him anymore. I stood there, staring at the two people I had trusted most outside of my own family, and something inside me shifted. Until that moment, I had believed the worst part of the day was discovering the affair. I was wrong. The worst part was realizing it had all been planned, a future designed without me, funded with money I had helped earn. Marlene turned toward me. "I'm sorry, Paula," she said softly. Her apology sounded sincere, but it changed nothing. I walked down the hallway without another word. Behind me, the argument erupted again, voices rising, towels moving, water splashing across the floor. I stepped out onto the porch. The air had turned colder, and dry leaves scraped across the driveway. A few minutes later, Glenn joined me, leaning against the railing beside me. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, "I suspected something." I nodded slowly. "So did I admitted, but I didn't want to be right." He exhaled deeply. "I checked our bank account this morning because a bill bounced," he said. That's when I started digging. I kept my eyes on the street as a neighbor's dog barked somewhere in the distance. Dan told me he had a big commercial job coming up, I said. Glenn shook his head. Maybe he does, he replied, but I doubt it. We stood there in silence for another minute. Inside the house, Marlene's voice rose above the others. You should both be ashamed of yourselves. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because everything had become so absurd. Finally, Glenn turned to me. What are you going to do now? He asked. The truth was, I didn't know yet. But one thought kept repeating in my mind. This wasn't just an affair. It was a plan. And plans come with consequences. That night, I packed a bag and drove to my sister Janice's house in Newburgh. As I pulled out of the driveway, I gave the house one last look. The porch light was still on. Dan's truck sat crooked in the driveway. Inside that house were two people who believed they had already written the ending of my story. They were wrong. Somewhere between discovering the affair and hearing about that lake cabin, I stopped seeing myself as a victim and started thinking strategically. My first night at Janice's place, I barely slept. Her home was a small ranch just outside Newburgh, in a quiet neighborhood where crickets filled the night and the occasional truck rolled along State Road 66. She prepared the guest room with clean sheets and left a glass of water on the nightstand. She didn't ask many questions. That's just how Janice is. When something goes wrong, she gives you space until you're ready to talk. Around midnight, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. Dan had already left 4 voicemails. I didn't listen to them. I already knew what they would sound like: excuses, promises, maybe even some anger once he realized I wasn't answering. Instead, I opened my photo gallery. The first image that appeared was from our 20th anniversary, Dan and me standing on the riverfront downtown, smiling like we had everything figured out. 22 years together. I stared at that picture for a long time before setting the phone aside. Janice knocked gently on the door. You awake? Yeah. She walked in carrying 2 mugs of tea, handed one to me, and sat by the window. For a while, we sat in silence. Then she asked the question everyone eventually asks. So, what are you thinking? I rubbed my forehead. I don't know yet. Janice nodded. That's okay, she said. But there's one thing you shouldn't do. What's that? Don't burn the house down. I gave her a tired look. That wasn't really on my list. She shrugged. Good, because you'll want that credit score later. That was Janice. Even in the middle of a disaster, she thought about mortgage rates and financial stability. Strangely enough, it grounded me. Because as the shock began to fade, my thoughts started shifting towards something else: numbers. Dan handled the job sites, but I took care of everything else: paperwork, invoices, payroll, permits, QuickBooks entries. For years, I had managed the books for Mercer Plumbing from a desk in our spare bedroom. I knew exactly where every dollar was supposed to go. The next morning, Janice left early for work. She runs a small insurance office and opens at 8. Before leaving, she placed a legal pad on the kitchen table. You're good with numbers, she said. Start there. I returned to my house around 9 o'clock. Dan's truck was gone. Terry's car wasn't there either. The house looked exactly as I had left it, quiet and still, as if nothing had happened. I went straight to the spare bedroom, turned on the computer, and opened the accounting software. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But as I dug deeper, patterns started to emerge. Small transfers labeled as subcontractor payments. Equipment purchases that never showed up. Charges spread out over several months. Individually, they weren't huge, but together, they added up. $8,000 here, $4,000 there. 2 weeks later, another $6,000 was gone. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Dan hadn't taken a single large amount. Instead, he had withdrawn small portions over time, carefully and quietly, like someone scooping water out of a bucket, hoping no one would notice the level slowly dropping. Next, I checked the company email account. There was nothing unusual at first glance, yet something kept bothering me. Acting on that feeling, I opened the browser history, and there it was, a Gmail account, busterandbella@gmail.com. I nearly laughed. Buster and Bella were our dogs, golden retrievers. We had named them together. Apparently, Dan believed that was clever enough to use for a secret email. I logged in, noticing he had saved the password in the browser. The inbox contained dozens of messages, most exchanged between Dan and Terry, property listings, cabin photos, and long discussions about docks and lake access. One email from a realtor near Lake Barkley mentioned a deposit that had already been made. Another included spreadsheets outlining future expenses. Reading through those emails felt like watching strangers map out a life that used to be mine. I slowly closed the laptop, then picked up my phone and, for the first time, listened to Dan's voicemails. The first one sounded almost casual. "Paula, listen. We need to talk about what happened yesterday." The second message was defensive. "You completely overreacted, locking us in that bathroom." The third took a different tone. "We're adults. We can handle this privately." I replayed that third message. Around noon, Janice came home for lunch and heard it as well. She leaned against the counter and shook her head. "Privately," she said, "he was naked in your bathtub with your best friend." We both laughed, not because it was funny, but because sometimes laughter is the only thing that keeps you from breaking down. After lunch, Janice asked again, "What are you going to do?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to walk away quietly, sell the house, and start over somewhere new. But another thought had begun forming in the back of my mind. Terry had already started spreading her version of the story. A mutual friend had texted me that morning, saying Terry was telling people I'd had some kind of emotional breakdown, that I locked them in the bathroom because I had lost control. I stared at my phone for a long time after reading that. Janice noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" I handed her the message. She read it, then raised an eyebrow. "So now you're the crazy one, apparently." She placed the phone down. "Well," she said, "if people are going to tell stories about you, you might as well tell the real one first." At that moment, something clicked in my mind. Saturday night, Mercer County Home and Garden Trade Night. Dan had been talking about that event for weeks. The fairgrounds would be packed with local contractors, homeowners, suppliers, and community leaders. He was even scheduled to give a short speech about business values, about trust, about being a family-owned company. I looked at the legal pad on the table, then at the financial records on my laptop, and finally at the message spreading lies about me. A strange calm settled over me. For the first time since Thursday afternoon, the shaking stopped. Janice watched my expression shift. "Oh," she said slowly. "What?" "That look." "What look?" "The one you used to get before high school debates." A small smile crossed my face. "If they want to tell stories about me," I said, "then I'll tell the truth." Janice leaned back in her chair. "Oh," she said, "now this I want to see." Outside the kitchen window, the wind picked up, rattling the dry leaves scattered across the yard. Saturday night was only 2 days away, and, for the first time since the affair began, I finally had a plan. By Saturday evening, the Mercer County Fairgrounds parking lot was already half full. Pickup trucks filled the gravel rows, while people made their way toward the main building carrying crockpots, folding chairs, and boxes of brochures. Trade night had been a local tradition for years. Contractors set up booths, local banks sponsor raffles, and half the town showed up to talk business while enjoying free barbecue. The air carried the rich scent of smoked ribs and kettle corn. Inside the large metal building, strings of lights stretched across the ceiling beams. Children ran past tables stacked with tool catalogs, while church ladies sold homemade pies near the entrance. It was exactly the kind of place where reputations could be made or destroyed. I arrived just minutes before Dan's speech was scheduled to begin, with Janice walking beside me. "You ready?" she asked quietly. I adjusted my coat and nodded. "I think so." Glenn stood near the back wall, speaking with one of the hardware suppliers. When he noticed us, he gave a slight nod, not a smile, just a quiet acknowledgement. Marlene sat at a folding table with a slice of apple pie in front of her, observing the crowd like a general surveying a battlefield. Terry, on the other hand, was easy to find. She stood near a floral display booth with one of her cousins, laughing a bit too loudly at something someone had said. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the room. Her smile froze, then she quickly looked away. I walked past her without slowing. My heart was pounding now, but my hands remained steady. At the front of the room, a small stage had been set up with a microphone and a banner that read, Mercer County Home and Garden Trade Night. Dan stood near the podium, talking with two men from the Chamber of Commerce. He looked polished, clean jeans, a company quarter-zip jacket with a Mercer Plumbing logo stitched across the chest, and on his wrist was the watch I had given him for our 20th anniversary. The sight of that watch nearly stopped me in my tracks. 22 years of marriage, reduced to a few pieces of metal and glass, reflecting the harsh overhead lights. Then Dan noticed me. His expression shifted in an instant, first surprise, then irritation, and finally something that looked a lot like panic. He moved toward me quickly. "Paula," he muttered under his breath, "what are you doing here?" "I came to listen," I replied. "This isn't the time for—" "Relax," I cut in. "You're about to give a speech, right?" His eyes darted around the room. "You need to leave." "Why?" His jaw tightened. "Because you're making a scene." I almost laughed at that. Before he could continue, one of the event organizers stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. A sharp burst of feedback pierced the room, and people began gathering closer. Dan inhaled slowly and stepped back toward the podium. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Maybe I'd lose my nerve. Maybe I'd turn around, walk out, and let him keep pretending everything was fine. Then he began speaking. "Good evening, everyone," Dan said confidently into the microphone. "For those who don't know me, I'm Dan Mercer, owner of Mercer Plumbing. We've proudly served this community for over 20 years. The crowd nodded politely. "My father always told me that running a family business is about trust," he continued. "It's about values. It's about building something solid your neighbors can rely on." Standing there listening to him talk about trust made my head spin. Just 48 hours earlier, this same man had been sitting in my bathtub with my best friend, planning a second life funded by the business we built together. And now he was preaching integrity. That was the moment I knew I wasn't leaving. Off to the side of the stage stood Rebecca Sloan, the attorney I had met earlier that week. She gave me a small, reassuring nod. Everything was in place. When Dan finished the first part of his speech, Rebecca leaned toward the event organizer and whispered something. The organizer looked surprised, then confused, but after a brief pause, he nodded. Dan had just started another sentence when Rebecca stepped onto the stage. "Excuse me, Dan," she said politely. He blinked. "What's this?" "Mrs. Mercer has a statement regarding the business." Dan looked at me as if he'd been struck. "Pa." But it was already too late. I stepped onto the stage. The microphone hummed softly as I adjusted it. The entire room fell silent. I recognized nearly everyone, neighbors, suppliers, church friends, even the local bank manager, people who had trusted Mercer Plumbing for years. I took a steady breath. "My name is Paula Mercer," I began, my voice calm, almost unnervingly so. "I've helped manage the bookkeeping for Mercer Plumbing for many years." Dan moved closer. "Paula, don't." I raised my hand slightly, and he stopped. The room waited. "Tonight, my husband spoke about trust and family values," I continued. "And I agree. Those things matter." A few people shifted uneasily, which is why I feel obligated to tell you that Dan Mercer has been involved in an affair with my longtime friend, Terry Barlow. The room froze. Across the crowd, Terry's face drained of color. "Stop," Dan whispered harshly. But I didn't. 2 days ago, I came home early and found them together in my house. A gasp rippled through the audience. Glenn stepped forward near the front. Rebecca handed me a folder, which I lifted slightly. Over the past several months, money has also been quietly moved from Mercer Plumbing accounts while plans were being made for a separate life outside this marriage. Dan lunged toward the microphone, but two event organizers quickly stepped between us. "This isn't necessary," he snapped. From the third row, Marlene's voice rang out, loud and clear. "Oh, it absolutely is." Heads turned as she stood, calmly setting her pie dish on the table. "Nobody accidentally ends up naked in a bubble bath with a married plumber," she said. A wave of shocked laughter passed through the crowd. Glenn stepped beside the stage. "I'm filing for divorce too," he said evenly. "Not for drama, for the truth." Dan's shoulders sagged. In that moment, The confident businessman who had been smiling just 10 minutes earlier seemed to shrink before everyone's eyes. Whispers spread through the room. One local contractor leaned toward another and muttered something I couldn't hear. The reputation Dan had spent years building was unraveling right in front of them. Terry quietly slipped out through a side door. As Marlene passed her, she remarked just loudly enough for others to hear, "Don't eat that pie, honey. You won't be able to swallow the shame." I stepped away from the microphone. The room buzzed with stunned conversation. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't lashed out. I had simply told the truth, and sometimes that carries more weight than any argument ever could. Dan tried to approach me again, but Glenn stepped in front of him. Not aggressively, just firmly. The event organizer cleared his throat nervously and announced a short break before the next presentation. Janice squeezed my shoulder. "You did it," she whispered.
I looked around the room one last time.
Every face told the same story. The secret was no longer hidden. The man who thought he controlled the narrative didn't anymore. The months that followed didn't feel like victory. They felt like cleanup. Legal paperwork piled up quickly. Divorce filings, financial disclosures, account reviews. The slow, grinding process of untangling 22 years of shared life. Dan called me several times during that first week. I didn't answer. Eventually, he began leaving messages again, but the tone had shifted. The confident voice from those earlier voicemails was gone. Now he sounded weary, defensive, even occasionally angry. "You embarrass me in front of the entire town," one message read. 2 days later, another appeared. "You didn't have to make it public like that." I listened to it once, then deleted it. Because the truth was straightforward. He had already made it public. I had merely illuminated it. Rebecca Sloan handled most of the legal discussions after that. Calm and practical, she spoke in measured sentences and never wasted a word. One afternoon in her office, she pushed a stack of documents toward me. "Your husband moved more money than we originally realized," she said. "How much?" I asked. "Almost $45,000 over the past year," she replied. I exhaled slowly. That figure no longer surprised me. "What happens now?" I inquired. Rebecca folded her hands. "Now the court decides how the assets are divided." Outside her office window, the courthouse square looked quiet and ordinary. People walked dogs. A couple sat on a bench eating ice cream. Life went on, regardless of whether marriages survived. Dan lost 2 contracts within the first month. News traveled quickly in a place like Evansville. Contractors talked, and customers talked even more. A plumber under financial investigation was not someone many homeowners wanted in their kitchens. Glenn filed for divorce the same week I did. I saw him once outside the Napa store while buying windshield wipers. He rang up the sale and handed me the receipt. For a moment, we just stood there. Finally, he said, "Well, that was one hell of a week." I nodded. "Yeah," he shrugged. "At least now we know the truth." There wasn't much else to say. Sometimes shared disappointment doesn't require a long conversation. Terry moved out of her house and went to stay with relatives in Owensboro. I heard this from Marlene, who called one afternoon just to apologize again. "You didn't deserve any of this," she said, her voice tired. "I'm sorry for the part my daughter played in it." I responded honestly. "I'm sorry too, because even though Terry had betrayed me, the situation had shattered more than just my marriage. Families don't break quietly. They fracture in every direction. Not everyone supported what I did. A few people avoided me at the grocery store. One woman from church told Janice she thought I should have handled things privately. Maybe she was right, but more people supported me than I expected. One afternoon, a man named Carl Simmons called. Carl owned a heating and cooling company across town. "I heard you handled the books for Mercer Plumbing," he said. "That's right," I replied. "I could use someone part-time who understands contractors and invoices, and I respect how you handled that situation," he continued. I smiled at the phone. "What situation?" I asked. He chuckled. "You know exactly which one." Within weeks, I was assisting with his company's bookkeeping. The work felt familiar. Numbers made sense in a way people sometimes didn't. Slowly, my life settled into a new rhythm. I moved back into the house after Dan found an apartment. Janice came over the first weekend to help me rearrange a few things. We didn't redecorate the entire house, but we made small changes. New bedspread, different curtains in the living room, and one afternoon, I replaced the bathroom lock. Not because it was broken, just because I wanted to. One evening in late January, I stood in the kitchen stirring a pot of chili on the stove. Snow tapped softly against the window. The house felt quieter than it used to, but not empty. Honest, that was the best word I could find. For a long time, after the divorce papers were finalized, people kept asking the same question. Do you regret what you did? The truth was complicated. No one enjoys seeing their life fall apart. No one wants to discover their marriage was built on lies. And revenge, well, revenge isn't the clean, satisfying feeling people imagine. It's messy. It hurts. It leaves scars. But sometimes, speaking the truth aloud is the only way to reclaim your story. Several months later, I ran into Dan at a gas station on the edge of town. He looked older, more exhausted. For a moment, we just stood beside the pumps. Finally, he said, "You ruined my reputation." I studied his face and answered quietly, "You did that yourself." He didn't argue, just nodded once and got back into his truck. I watched him drive away, without the anger I expected. Mostly, I felt relief. Betrayal forces you to learn something about yourself. I had spent years trying to protect a version of my marriage that no longer existed. When the truth finally surfaced, it hurt, but it also freed me. That winter night in my kitchen, I tasted the chili and added a little more salt. The radio played softly. Outside, the snow kept falling. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel frightening. It felt like something I was finally allowed to write myself. I didn't win because Dan lost. I won because I stopped letting his lies define the kind of woman I was. If you've ever rebuilt your life after someone you trusted broke it, you probably understand that feeling. And if this story means something to you tonight, thank you for listening. Sometimes sharing the truth helps more people than we realize.